All right. Well, we're going to talk about read aloud, talk aloud, and think aloud. And then you're going to do a demonstration. Okay.
Are you ready?
We are yours.
Okay. I'd like to talk about what they are, why use the read aloud, the talk aloud, or the think aloud with nonfiction prose, how to select the passages, and then to demonstrate each one of them within the context of a lesson. I'll start with the read aloud. The primary purpose of the nonfiction read aloud is to share common content with students as part of the material supporting a lesson in science, social studies, mathematics, or other curriculum areas. Or to share content students might not be able to read themselves, but would be able to understand. A secondary purpose is to model reading goals you wish students to attain. In the case of the read aloud, the overt modeling of fluent reading, and less overt, the focused gathering of meaning from text. For many students, the read aloud helps in building vocabulary, which is an aid to building concepts in science, social studies, and mathematics, as well as a boost to general literacy. When you select a passage to use in a nonfiction read aloud, the passage should of course be well written, and it should address science, social studies, or mathematics concepts or content you wish the students to attain or inquire into. Now I'd like to just demonstrate a brief read aloud as if it's part of our unit on the study of animals. As part of our science unit on animals and how they live and behave in their natural environment, we've studied different animals we've seen on the school ground and animals that you have at home. In the last 2 days, we've been reading and writing about squirrels. And yesterday, I read Squirrels All Year Long, and several of you got some good ideas from the author about how to describe the animal you were studying, and some ideas about photographs that you could take to help make your ideas clearer to readers. Today, I have another book to share with you about squirrels, and this one is Brian Wildsmith's Squirrels. As I read just the first 2 pages, listen and see how many characteristics of squirrels our author includes in this one short paragraph. It's easy to recognize a squirrel. He is a furry, small animal with long, bushy tail, 2 strong back legs, 2 small front paws, 2 large tufted ears which stick up, and 2 big front teeth. He looks happy and mischievous. All right, what physical characteristics of squirrels did Brian Wildsmith give us as his readers? And that's the read aloud. The only essential attribute of the nonfiction read aloud is that you read aloud a short passage, conceptual one preferably, to your students.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about the various purposes of that?
Other than what I mentioned at first about the primary purpose being to share content with students as part of a science or social studies unit you're working on, that was one of the major purposes.
Just to share content.
Yes. Do you want me to go on with the other one, even though it's repeating the same thing I said at first?
Yes, please.
Okay. The other is it's also sharing content, but in this case, it's content students might not be able to read on their own. Even many of your students might not be able to read on their own, but they would be able to understand it, the concepts that are present in it. So for your, as I said, when you select your passage for your nonfiction read aloud, you are selecting it because of the concepts that are present in it, concepts that are part of a science or social studies, mathematics, or an interdisciplinary unit you're teaching. So your content is your big purpose there. Now, that, again, I don't want to forget that secondary purpose being the modeling of fluent reading, which is overt or explicit, and then sort of the less overt modeling of gathering meaning from text. And then the tool that's a help to both content areas and literacy is the building of vocabulary.
Could you use this at almost any level?
I can't think of any level that it wouldn't be appropriate, including university.
Right. Would you ever read material that the children can read?
Well, that was the first purpose. When you can, it's for sharing material. It may be within their reading level, or it may not. But you can do it either way. It's just you're choosing the concepts you want to present. And with most of the major concepts or principles or generalizations in science, social studies, or mathematics, many of them can be found presented in very simple text, but some are in more advanced text that wouldn't be within the reading range of your students, but it would be within their cognitive grasp. Now on to the talk aloud. The primary purpose of the nonfiction talk aloud is to help students use the reading-writing connection to comprehend prose or to compose prose. One way to do this is for the teacher to share examples of text in which the author has used literary devices or techniques that worked well for the teacher as reader. The teacher explains to the student what worked, what you appreciated about the author's presentation, and you encourage students to find and discuss examples that work for them as readers. When the teacher chooses to use the talk aloud in nonfiction, it gives the students one more chance to learn science, social studies, and mathematics concepts, and to discuss the choice of literary devices and writing techniques used by authors to present their ideas to readers, thus reinforcing the intentionality of the author and the choices he or she makes in trying to communicate with the reader. It's also very easy to move from the reading comprehension talk aloud into the composing. I could use that in writing about how my animal behaves. As with the read aloud, other purposes for the talk aloud include the modeling of fluent reading, the gathering of meaning from text, and in this case with a little more attention to the craft of writing, and of course the building of vocabulary. When you select a passage for nonfiction talk alouds, the passage should be an example of text presentation which you as a teacher personally found appealing and useful as a reader. And of course, it should address science, social studies, mathematics concepts or content you wish the students to attain or inquire into. Okay. Now I'd like to do a short demonstration as if it's part of a lesson. It's going to be very similar at the beginning to what I did with the read aloud. As part of our science unit on animals and how they live and behave in their natural environment, we've been studying animals we've seen on the school ground and animals that you have at home. In the last 2 days, we've been reading and writing about squirrels. And yesterday, I read Squirrels All Year Long. And many of you picked up some ideas from this author about how to describe the animal you were studying, and some ideas about photographs you could take that would help the reader get your major point. Today, I have another book to share with you about squirrels, and they're very similar. Melvin Berger presented Squirrels All Year Long, and Brian Wildsmith describes the squirrel and then talks about the behavior of squirrels during the year. So they're very similar in many ways in terms of the content they're presenting, but you can tell just from looking at the covers of the two books how there are also some differences in author's presentation. today I'm going to read you first just the first 2 pages of Brian Wild Smith's Squirrels. Then I want to tell you some of the things I especially liked about this author's introduction to squirrels. It is easy to recognize a squirrel. He is a furry, small animal with a long, bushy tail, 2 strong back legs, 2 small front paws, 2 large, tufted ears which stick up, and 2 big front teeth. He looks happy and mischievous. I liked the rhythm of how the author put together the information that he was giving us, and he did it in such a short space. And he did it in a way I could remember, from tail to teeth. He said, a long bushy tail, 2 strong back legs, 2 small front paws, 2 large tufted ears, and 2 big front teeth, tail to teeth. And all of that in terms of a description of the characteristics of the squirrel. So, good rhythm and lots of information about the squirrel in a very short space. It helped me remember the physical description or physical characteristics of the squirrel. Today, when you're reading in your animal books, see if you can find a page or 2 where the author gives you useful information about the animal in a way that's really easy for you to remember. And be ready to share that during partner time or book club time during the next few days. That's it for the Talk Aloud. Do you have questions?
Yes. Is the difference here when you did the read aloud and now the talk aloud over the same material, the more detailed concentration on content and how it was presented? That is the author's use of the sequence from tail to head and that kind of thing. What is the particular difference in emphasis?
In the Talk Aloud, the emphasis is on, it's a little more, well, it is more on the literary devices or writing techniques the author used in presenting the content. But it's not separated from the content because its attention to those literary devices or to the writing techniques as a way to present the ideas sharply or clearly in a way that might help the reader understand or follow them or hold on to them better.
So there's really an overlap, but you're paying more attention. You're drawing the kids' attention to how the writer worked.
The intentional presentation of ideas in a certain fashion that worked for the reader. And in this case, when the teacher models, it should be the passages should work for the teacher as a reader. And then you encourage students to find examples that worked for them, both in terms of comprehension and appreciation of presentation.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more about the objectives?
All right. For all of the nonfiction alouds, the read aloud, the talk aloud, the think aloud, part of the emphasis is on the content, science, social studies, mathematics, whatever concepts are there. But where they vary, where they're different, is in the read aloud. That's the primary focus, is the content, bringing students into contact with particular concepts. Okay. With the talk aloud, your primary goal is to get them to be able to use the reading-writing connection as readers and as writers. One way to do this is to model your use of it, how you notice what the writer has there in terms of literary device or writing techniques that worked for you, that helped. In the case I was using on the squirrels, this description of the squirrel is very important. And the author put a lot of information in just 3 relatively short sentences in an order that was easy for me to follow and to think about. And I liked the rhythm of it, the 2, 2, 2, that also helped me follow the characteristics and helped me also think of, in a sense, the symmetry of the animal. So you try to model whatever presentation technique that the author used to get his or her ideas across. You explain how that worked for you, and you only do it in cases where it really worked for you as a reader. So the attention of the talk aloud is on using how readers can use devices or strategies that are there to comprehend and to gather meaning, and how they might be able to use those same devices or strategies or writing techniques in their own composing to help their readers. And that makes the full reading-writing loop. You can take it from either the standpoint of the reader or the standpoint of yourself as a writer trying to help your reader.
Is it fair to say that this is a consciousness-raising lesson?
Yes. Yes.
To help people become more aware of what the author's doing.
And why.
And why, so that they can profit from it more.
Yes.
So it is, in a certain sense, a consciousness-raising comprehension lesson.
Yeah. No.
Yep. Now we're going to go to the
Think aloud. The primary purpose of the structured nonfiction Think Aloud is to help students use reading comprehension processes and strategies. When using the structured Think Aloud, the teacher explains the reading comprehension process or strategy, what it is, and why it's important, and then she models or demonstrates it and provides students with opportunities to practice using it themselves. This cycle of explanation, demonstration, and practice continues until students have at least basic use of that reading comprehension process or strategy, and optimally automatic or fluid use. When the teacher uses the structured Think Aloud in nonfiction, it gives the students one more chance to learn science, social studies, and mathematics concepts, and to discuss content issues as well as comprehension issues. The structured Think Aloud also provides a base for understanding why authors structure or organize their presentations in a certain way, because they're often trying to support comprehension of their ideas by us as readers. As with the Read Aloud and the Talk Aloud, other purposes include the modeling of fluent reading and the building of vocabulary. Now, in the nonfiction Think Aloud, the selection of the passage is a little different. With this strategy, you determine first what major comprehension process or strategy your students need help with immediately. This is really a determining priority for what you're going to focus on, and it's usually for several lessons, not just one lesson. Some of the processes include things like determining and using main idea, using multiple sources to draw a conclusion, making and checking predictions, or some of the strategies. And strategies are just what reading scholars call little plans of action that you could use with any text. Some of the reading comprehension processes you cannot use with any text. For example, you can't use using comparison and contrast to follow the major message unless the text has comparison and contrast in it. But strategies are little plans you can use with any text. And some of the strategies that have been studied are things like, how do you determine importance? Whatever it is. It could be things like boldface print to how many times things are repeated. Another strategy would be summarizing. You can summarize over any kind of text. Okay. So you've got your old traditional comprehension processes that many of you are familiar with: determining and using main idea, determining relevance of information, using multiple sources. There are at least a dozen really major ones. Then you have these little plans of action that you can use with any kind of text. So you decide what it is your students most need that's going to make the most difference to them as a group right now as readers. And then you design and select your passage so that you can model the use of that comprehension process or strategy for your students. And of course, if you're using it in nonfiction, I'm going to demonstrate a think aloud. We've been working the last few weeks on determining main idea and using it to understand more fully the author's message. As we began work on our animal unit, observing and recording information about the animals we see on the school grounds and animals you have at home, and reading about animal characteristics and behaviors, you're going to encounter many, many descriptions of animals, their behaviors, and their habitats. In these descriptions, the authors often ask us to use our senses, to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, to experience what something is like, what the animal is like, what it looks like, what it feels like, and where it lives. Here are a few quick examples. The first one is from Looking at Penguins by Dorothy Henshaw Patton. Just one paragraph. The penguin's body is shaped like a torpedo, and water flows smoothly over it as the bird swims. Its neck is short and thick and doesn't interrupt the body's smooth outline. While all penguins are stocky, they range in size from just over 2 pounds to about 90 pounds. Here the author really wants us to see the penguin and what it looks like, and there's a big clue in the title, Looking at Penguins. Or here in Winter by Ron Hershey. Winter is a time for deer to leap through the crunching snow. So we have something about the deer, but we also have a sense of what the environment is like and how it sounds if we were there, experiencing that, watching that deer, hearing the snow crunch as the deer moved through it. Or this one from A Tree is Growing. Bark is the skin of a tree. The outer layer of bark protects the tree. When an oak tree is young, the bark is as smooth as a baby's skin. As the tree grows older, the bark becomes rough and cracked. And in this one, the author's really trying to help us get a sense of both how it looks and how it would feel. Smooth as a baby's skin when it's very young. And then the older it gets, the more roughed and cracked and craggy almost it gets. Okay. Today, we're going to begin a series of lessons on recognizing and using descriptions to help us follow the author's major message, to help us more fully comprehend. Because in many instances, the main message or main idea is the description. It might just simply be the physical characteristics of the animal. But in some cases, these physical characteristics, the elements of the description, are necessary for understanding how the animal lives in its environment. So in some ways, this is just another way of recognizing and using main idea as we try to get all the author's meaning and purpose. But during the next few weeks, we're going to focus specifically on comprehending and using descriptions because they're so important in doing science, whether we're readers or writers. And authors put these descriptions together to help us see, hear, smell, taste, feel, and think about animals, environments, things, and places. They want us to experience what they're describing, to understand what something is like. And if we're going to fully comprehend what the authors have provided, we must recognize what they're doing and why they've included specific information in their descriptions. To fully understand what the author has provided in a description, we need to do at least 3 things. We need to recognize what is being described and how it's being described, and why this information is important. Today, I will share how I recognized and began to use the description Brian Smith provided in his opening paragraph of squirrels. It is easy to recognize a squirrel. He is a furry small animal with a long bushy tail, 2 strong back legs, 2 small front paws, 2 large toughed ears which stick up, and 2 big front teeth. He looks happy and mischievous. Well, my first clue is in the opening, the very first sentence. It says it's easy to recognize a squirrel. And when I read the word recognize, it made me think, look, he wants me to see the squirrel. Then, when I looked at the other sentences after my first quick reading, I thought, this is a list. This is a list of physical characteristics. He's giving me 4 or 5 things, all in a list. Furry, small animal, long bushy tail, 2 strong back legs, 2 small front paws, 2 large toughed ears which stick up, and 2 big front teeth. So I had that in the first, that recognizes me to see it, and then gives me a list of several physical characteristics. And that helped me actually to draw a picture in my mind. And then as I read more in the book and read through it, it didn't take me very long to read it, I thought, you know, here Brian Smith was introducing me to squirrels, just like the character in a fiction book. And as I read more in the book, I realized that the author was telling me, he was showing me how those physical characteristics affected how the squirrel lived and behaved. And you know, I found 7 pages just on the long bushy tail, all about how the squirrel used that tail in moving from tree to tree, and in keeping itself warm, and in swimming. So, I recognized the description. It was a description of a squirrel. It was mostly physical, telling me how the squirrel looked, and asking me to see the squirrel. And it was used to connect the physical characteristics to the animal's behavior. So what I did was think, what is being described? How is it being described? And why are these details, why are these specific characteristics of the squirrel included? Now, each of you look at this description on penguins. Now, each of you look at this description. I'm going to use a big book. Identify what is being described, how, which senses or emotions, what's the author asking you to do or use to be there in this description, and see if you can predict why the author has provided this information. That's it. You may notice that the think aloud took longer than the read aloud and the talk aloud, and that's very common. You can do a read aloud in just a minute or 2 and have a very productive one. In 5 minutes easily you can have a very productive one and involve the students in the discussion. The talk aloud, 3 to 5 minutes. Sometimes if you involve the students very much in it before they go to work on their own talk alouds, but rarely more than 8, 10 minutes. But with a think aloud, because you're going to explain the process or strategy you're going to be modeling. You're going to talk about why it's useful. You're going to model it and then set students up for practice. It generally takes longer. And in this case, I didn't just send the students to find examples in their books, because they could have probably easily found descriptions in their books. But first I want to set it up, and we're going to use one of the big books. I'm going to set it up for us to do one together.
All right. Let's go back to the squirrel.
Okay.
Think of the first thing you did with a read aloud.
Yes.
Am I right that the objective there was to provide information about the squirrel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you've emphasized that in the particular kinds of read-alouds that you're talking about with nonfiction, it happens largely in the context of a study or a unit or a lesson that's on a particular thing in science, social studies, or mathematics, and you're sharing information with the kids.
Yes.
And that's the primary objective.
Of the read aloud.
Right. To give the kids some information by reading to them. Mm-hmm. Then with the talk aloud, you were raising their awareness of the fact that there was an author at work creating an environment that would make it easier to get the information. That the author's intentionality was there. And eventually when they become authors, that they would pay attention to that also.
That they would display that same kind of intentionality.
Right.
And trying to help their readers get their message.
So they're understanding that you don't just pick up a book that wasn't written by somebody. It was written by somebody who's working on ways of conveying whatever it is they're trying to convey. Then as you come to the think aloud, you're now identifying particular devices that authors use in a very explicit way because you think the students need those devices to help them comprehend. Is that correct?
I wouldn't put the think aloud in that way. My focus in my head on the think aloud are on comprehension processes or strategies I want my students to have.
Right.
Like if they're having trouble figuring out main idea, I'm going to select passages that have very clear main idea and we're going to work with those.
In terms of how the author conveyed the main idea. Is that right? That
would be just part of it. My focus would be on getting them to recognize the main idea. It may be structured in many different ways, but my focus is on having the students come to the text and use tools for figuring out main idea.
Okay, let me see if I can put that in my language. That authors express a main idea, say, or provide descriptions of things. And the reader has got to figure out that idea using the tools that the writer has provided.
Using the text that's present, which may include a particular organizational pattern or maybe even several different patterns, like they may use description and then also comparison and contrast to make the point about how alligators and crocodiles are alike and different, which would be the full message the author would want to get across. So the student comes to that text with some tools or comprehension tools to figure out the message the author wants him or her to take away. So you can't really separate comprehending from what's present in the text, but in the talk aloud, you're just noticing anything you liked and enjoyed, appreciated about how the author presented a message or a point or some detail. With the think aloud, you are sort of tackling text with the idea of, say, using the tools you have for determining main idea, or using the tools you have for summarizing, or for making predictions and checking them out. So you come to the text with a toolkit of the common comprehension strategies or processes that you can use.
Yes. This is, however, to heighten the awareness of those tools, is it not? and to get people to apply them?
This is to model how a person comprehends, how a person would use, how a person would determine what is important,
So
how a person would use any context clues that are present in the text. So the big burden is on, and burden's not the right word, the idea is to help students have a whole toolkit of ways to determine main idea.
Now, in the Think Aloud, are you enhancing that toolkit?
Yes, that's your goal, is for the students to be able to use any of those common comprehension processes or strategies fluidly over any kind of text.
So in a particular Think Aloud, are you isolating one of those? Or?
Well, in the structured Think Aloud, that's the way I've designed it, is to focus on the major ones at first until students have those under their belt. And then you can begin combining if you wish. Like I would do description before I worked on comparison and contrast. Because if we were using that, I'm talking about text structure, and that's just one little part of what might be present in text to help students comprehend.
What is one little part?
The text structure of things like descriptions or comparison and contrast. But if I were going to help students use descriptions as part of following the author's message, I would do that before I would do helping them use comparison and contrast, because descriptions are often part of the comparison and contrast text structures. But you could have a passage on main idea that didn't have either of those. I mean, it's just they're tools for just figuring out what is the major message here that do not have anything particularly to do with how this text is organized.
When you model a particular one, do you then give the kids texts that have that one embedded in it?
Yes.
So they can practice?
Yes. At first, that's essential when you're first kicking off. Like, I decided to do this one on recognizing and using descriptions to comprehend the author's full message.
Right.
Because it's so important in units on science or units on plants, and and to the doing of science. Good, accurate descriptions, whether we're trying to read them or we're trying to write them ourselves. So I selected this particular recognizing and using descriptions to fully comprehend the author's message. To me, that's just an elaborate main idea, using one particular kind of text structure, but it still comes under the grouping of recognizing and using main idea to get the author's full message. So I selected it because I figured all my students needed it. It was so critical to understanding the materials. I wanted them to experience, and especially to using them fully, and to being able to use, to think about writing so that their readers would be able to comprehend more fully.
Now let's talk for a minute to a teacher. By the way, when do you start this? Do you start it in kindergarten?
Yes.
So you start it when the kids are just beginning to learn to read.
Yes.
And then you'll continue forever, I suppose, because the more complex strategies reveal themselves in the more complex material that people read. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, if I were, let's make me for a minute and talk to me as a third grade teacher, say. Okay. And I know that as I begin to teach, my kids will come with a range of these. Some will have very few of them, and some will have more of them, and that's the way life is. But I want to ensure that during the year I expose them to a number of the ones that are going to be very useful over and over again.
Yes.
Talk about those. You talked about little strategies, other things, but in my head, what are some of the major ones that I ought to be prepared to teach, I would expect I would have to teach to most of the kids?
Well, we think we teach it every year, but one of the main ones is still recognizing and using main idea. You know, what is the author's major message? And it may be literal, it may actually be stated very clearly, or it may be more implicit. Like, I think to fully understand something as simple but as well crafted as Brian Wildsmith's squirrels, it's easy to recognize the topic. It's about squirrels. And even to see the physical description. But unless you think about it, in a sense you're monitoring your own comprehension and use of text, many readers don't connect that list of physical characteristics in the first 2 pages to the behavior of the squirrel throughout the book. So, to me, the whole thing is recognizing and using that description and understanding the behavior of the squirrel is part of the author's major message. So while we teach main idea every year, we rarely take it all the way, what I would think of as all the way through, with the level of text which students can understand. And while this may be appropriate for kindergarten, first, second, whatever, that last part of understanding and fully using that description to get the concept of physical characteristics and how that relates to the behavior of the animal in the environment, which is the real full comprehension, a large part of what Brian Wildsmith gives us if we understand the content message, is missed. We often don't take it that far when we're working on recognizing and using main idea.
Is it fair to say it's not just a simple formula?
No.
And am I right that with Brian's book on the squirrel, the topic is the squirrel?
Yes.
But the idea as he plays it out is how the physical structure of the squirrel plays out in the squirrel's life.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's the main idea.
Yes.
How the physical structure plays out that.
Yes.
So topic is not a main idea.
That's correct.
It's in a sense the concepts that are developed over that topic.
Yes.
And the ones the author has selected to emphasize, in this case, how the physical structure affects many other things in the squirrel's life.
That's right. That's what I would call fully comprehending what the author has provided. I mean, that's not the only thing he gives us in this little book, but is, I'd say, one of the major concepts present.
So when we're done reading, we have information about the squirrel, but the concept that we've got is the relationship of the structure of the squirrel to these many other things that are described in the book.
That's right.
So if we didn't get that, we wouldn't have comprehended the book.
That's
we just
right.
have a list of information.
That's right. And he doesn't tell us. He doesn't hop from the 2 pages where he describes and say, now, I'm going to tell you how these physical characteristics relate to the behavior of the squirrel. The good reader has to bring his or her toolkit to looking at that description and thinking about how it was done and why the author provided it.
Right. So the job of the reader that you're teaching the children is to dig out the topic and the information, but also the overriding concept or theme that constitutes what we call a main idea.
Yes. Yes.
Now, so I want to teach my children that. What are the other things I want to be real sure I teach of this same sort?
The main idea one, both in terms of literal or stated and implicit, is a major one. I'd say another one, of course, is using context clues. when the author's provided information in terms of connected text to help them know more about a word, whether it's the tuft ears, where you have to look at it in relation to the ears and the picture that the author provides, but how to seek out the information that's there and use it to more fully understand a word or concept.
Now, a lot of people have thought of context clues as the material that surrounds a particular word you're trying to understand the meaning of.
And that's part of it.
But I think you mean something else here.
Well, I mean that, but that's not all there is to it.
So, talk about context clues just a little.
Well, it's like data tracking. I mean, if you've taught students how to search the surrounding text and illustrations for meaning related to a word they're not familiar with, it's just like being a good detective. If they can do it, they can understand that he refers to the squirrel or he refers to Mr. Johnson. They can figure out what pronouns refer to. They can use it to build meaning from across several pages if they're trying to understand something like democracy or something like photosynthesis. So it's not just, we often teach it within just one sentence, like where the author gives us another word for synthesis right there beside synthesis in parentheses, or gives us a phrase explaining synthesis right there in parentheses, or uses an appositive, just another way of saying that same word, and it's set off by commas usually. So we often teach context clues within a sentence level, but in terms of really using connected text, and in the case of many of our good nonfiction books, illustrations also, it's really data tracking, using any information that's been provided to help us understand what's there.
Okay. Now, what are some of the others I should have in mind?
Okay, so we've talked about main idea, which is the big one. We've talked about context clues. Others are making and checking predictions. You know, and it can be as simple as if we looked at a book called Squirrels, what would we predict it would be about? Or if we looked at a chapter book that's divided into sections and one has the dwellings of the Incas, you know, what will we predict it would be about? And as we look through, if we sort of preview a section in a textbook or in a book we're going to read, as we preview the headings, does that tell us what it's like, what it's going to be about? And that sort of serves as a little mental set for engaging with the text. So we look at the headings, or we look at the title in the text, and we think about what's going to happen here, what's it going to be about, and then we read, and having that active engagement before we read and then as we read helps us take more from the presentation of material. Or when you've finished one section and you're thinking about, now what's going to come next? It's just a way of actively engaging a little bit more with what's being provided.
So do we do that because we know that authors use titles and other enunciations in their prose to give us clues about what's going to happen?
That's part of it. One part is to use anything that's there to help us follow the message, and the authors intentionally use things like headings or subheadings to help us follow the key points they want to make, or the sequence they want us to follow, or critical attributes. However, I think also that active engagement of the reader, thinking about now, what's coming next? Why has the author said this? It just is a little bit more of an active engagement than when you just notice the heading. I think that active engagement is actually a mental set for engaging with the following prose and connecting it to the previous.
What are some of the others?
I think using multiple sources of information to make a decision. I think forming questions. When do you realize that you know something about how the squirrel behaves in winter and how the bear behaves in winter and how the otter behaves in winter? You know a little bit about it, but you don't know enough to know how, are there some behaviors that are very alike and you're going to need to seek out more information. So I think recognizing when you don't know and you need to find out more information, that's like good readers behave that way. And knowing that you've got to so you formed a question and you want to find more information in relation to your question. So I think forming questions.
Does that relate to a kind of set that you want to know everything you can about something given the material you've got, so that you're hunting for a roundness, if you will, of concept about any given piece of material?
Well, I'm not sure, but I do know that good readers develop a sense of when they have enough information to know, say, how an animal behaves in winter, or when something is missing, when they only have a little bit of information. And I don't have quite the right words to describe it, but it's a sense of knowing, hey, I know something about how this animal behaves, but I don't have a full picture. Or I know how this animal behaves and this animal behaves, but I don't know how they're alike, or there's some important characteristics that have to do with that class of animals that relates to their behavior.
So kind of a sense of how much control you've got and how much you don't have.
That's right.
And you develop that as you go along.
And I think it's different for each individual, but I think what we want to foster as teachers is the continuous seeking and using of information and trying to see similarities and differences. Because if we just take our unit on animals, part of what we're after is understanding the classification system for living and non-living, and in this case, living things, and one part of living things being animals. And then what are the different classes within that, and what puts them in those categories, and why is that important to know anyway?
Just list some of the other comprehension skills.
Okay, let's see, the ones I've done. Recognizing and using main idea, using context clues, forming questions, making and checking predictions, using multiple sources of information. Those are big processes. Some of the strategies are things that scholars of research call, and I'm defining strategies for people in the way the reading field has defined it as little plans of action that can be used with any text.
And
so
these are?
I'm switching from the reading comprehension processes over to reading comprehension strategies. The reading comprehension, and there's some overlap, but the reading comprehension strategies, the little plans of action that you can use with any text that have been the most researched are summarizing.
Is that when you stop periodically and summarize what
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
So that's a comprehension strategy?
Yes.
Okay. Others?
Making predictions. That's an overlap. Retelling, and that's sort of a retelling of what has happened. It's similar to the summarizing. And there's one more, the determining importance.
Right.
And some people would put main idea process as a subset of determining importance. I don't do that. Some people do, but it's all the ways you determine what an author feels is important or what you feel is important. It could have to do with how you're reading or what's present in the text.
Okay, now finally, and just for a minute or so, talk a little bit about some of those that we've discussed in the past, like the use of causation, analogies, comparisons, all that kind of thing.
I would put most of those under recognizing and using main idea to fully comprehend the author's message. Because so often those text structures, those authors have organized text in a particular way to help us comprehend, like the description of the squirrel or the comparison of snakes and lizards.
How about Cactus Hotel?
Right, I would call that a metaphorical analogy or an extended metaphorical analogy. It has description in it, but it's a comparison. It's to help us understand how much the saguaro cactus is like a hotel, and that animals can use it as a place for safety, as a place to be cool or to be warm, and to be high above the ground. So but to me, that's using that extended metaphorical analogy, that comparison, to get the author's major message about the saguaro cactus and how it's used by animals in its environment, and how that relationship between the saguaro and the animals is in many ways mutually beneficial, because the little holes don't hurt it, and the woodpeckers and some of the birds actually get rid of insects that would be harmful to it.
So if we get the metaphor, we've got, in a sense, the main concept or idea under which the author strung the information that we're given.
That's right. It's just like the example of the opening paragraph of Brian Wild Smith's Squirrels, that to fully comprehend the author's message about the relationship between physical characteristics and the behavior of the squirrel and its environment, it's not just stated there for us to see, but it's there for the good reader to use if they engage with the text enough. It's the same thing in Cactus Hotel. That relationship between the saguaro cactus and its environment is what I think the author wants us to take away.
Now, just the last thing, what's your kind of a half-minute statement of what's your best advice to us as we try to teach the kids to comprehend? What do we need to keep in our heads all the time?
I think model and student practice, watch what they do, model and student practice. It really is a version of selecting the processes or strategies you want to emphasize and really set as priority if we're thinking about the think aloud. And then explaining to the students what they are and why they're useful, demonstrating them for the students and giving students practice. And to do it all in the context of important social studies or science concepts that we're working on, so that we get double benefit for our efforts and for our students' efforts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Calhoun.